Okay, so just a bit of a disclaimer just as we start. So the views in the workshop don't necessarily reflect those of Upskill in Lancashire and UCLan. Any views that are expressed within this presentation will be my own or NORI's HR and employment law based on our experience, and the figures and facts that we give at the time of recording are believed to be accurate. So I thought it was important that we do touch on slightly the furlough update that was announced just last week. This is a very simple graph to outline the changes that are coming about. So June and July, nothing changes in regards to the 80% that the government are supporting businesses with. Towards the end of June, on the 30th of June, the scheme will come to a close for new employers and new employees to be registered. So if you haven't already registered an employee by that date, then they won't be eligible past that point. Now, the last date that you can register someone for furlough, if they haven't previously been on furlough, is the 10th of June. The reason that date is significant, if they're a new employee that's never been on furlough previously, is because you still have to take into the consideration the 3 weeks of furlough status to be eligible for the scheme. So put the 10th of June into your calendars if you haven't previously furloughed an employee. July, the government have then kick-started where employers can bring back employees on a part-time basis. At the moment, the government have left it to employers to determine what they see as part-time. August onwards, then we start to have contributions. So from August, employers will have to pay the employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions. September, on top of those contributions, the employers then pay 10%, as well as the government paying 70% to top it up to 80%, and the £2,500 cap. And then October, the employer's contributions goes up to 20%. Any questions came through on that, Ian? Are we happy?
No, everybody seems to be clear about that. Just one comment from Suzanne, if you could just speak up a little bit. I think the mic is a little bit low, so.
No problem. Is that any better, Suzanne? Yeah, okay. No problem. So these are going to be topics we're going to be touching on today. So as the poll suggested, we're going to be touching on flexible working requests, contracts, handbooks, policies and procedures, restructures. We'll spend more time on team engagement, as that seemed to be the area that people wanted to focus on, and capability and conduct procedures. So we'll go straight into the flexible working requests. So these are the criteria that employees need to have in order to make a flexible working request. So they need to have been employed for a period of 26 weeks. They can only make one flexible working request in any 12-month period, and that's a rolling 12-month period. So if an employee has made an application within that time period, the employer doesn't have to take it into consideration. It's then down to the employer whether they want to or not. It must be in writing. Obviously, as mentioned, state whether the employee has previously made any such application, and it has to be dated. Any process within a flexible working has to follow a set process and has to be handled in a reasonable manner. There's a 3-month deadline from the date of the application for the process to be concluded. That also includes any appeal process and any trial period, which we'll touch on briefly next. Now, recently, Direct Line carried out a survey of 2,000 adults, and 2 in 5 people are ready to ask their employer for permanent flexible working arrangements after the coronavirus restrictions. Now, if we look at the Office of National Statistics, where there's just over 33 million people in employment, if you use the same statistics on that, that's just over 13 million workers or employees will look or want flexible working. So quite a significant figure when you're looking at that from an employment basis and from a company basis.
I have got a question if you want to take it at this point from a
yeah.
RE, the 10th of June registration date for furlough. We have been doing furlough on a rota basis, e.g. 1 month on, 1 month off. Because they've been furloughed before, e.g. furloughed in April, but have worked June, can they still be furloughed from the 1st of July because they've been previously through furlough? Does that make sense?
If you've been doing it on a rota basis and leading up to that point, individuals haven't been on furlough, then you need to start their second batch or third batch, or whichever batch of furlough it is, on the 10th of June for them to have that 3-week eligibility criteria. As I said, from July onwards, then the government have launched that the part-time basis without it affecting the furlough status. So your 10th of June is the deadline that if you are running this rotational basis, you need to get the employees back on furlough.
Thanks, Jason.
So as we touched on, the trial period during any flexible working request, if you're unsure as an employer whether flexible working is going to work, now obviously when it comes to home working and remote working, a lot of organizations have been thrown into it, so you'll have an indication whether it's productivity or whatever KPIs you have in place to know whether it is working. But if you want to trial it on a permanent basis, whatever it is that the individual, the employee has asked for, you can do. What I'd always recommend if you are running it for several months is to look to extend the deadline of that 3-month rule, so you're not restricting yourself on time periods. But that has to be by mutual agreement with both parties. But anything you agree, always put into written form. Whether it's an email, whether it's an actual letter, always have some document to indicate what has been agreed between both parties. And as an employer, always have the right to revert to previous working arrangements. I don't need to go through each of these. So these are the 9 reasons why an employer can refuse a flexible working request. Again, these slides are going to be available, so you don't need to document each one. So there are reasons and there are set processes when you're following flexible working that an employer can turn around and say it's not going to be applicable. Something to take into consideration when you are considering refusing is each employee, when they make flexible working, are doing it for a certain reason. They're not just doing it on a whim. So always look at it from both sides, obviously from the employer side and the employee side. And this will touch on the engagement and staff morale. If I'm seeing a lot of larger organizations with the mentality, and it's not every organization, with the mentality that when the COVID situation comes to an end, they're going to have everyone back in the office. They're not even considering any flexible working or remote working. They want everyone back in the office. Now, the issues with that, obviously, if people are requesting it and it has worked, the employer needs to come up with some grounds as to why it's not eligible, why it won't work for them as an organization. If it's just going to be a flat out, we have never done it, we only did it because of COVID, and now everyone's back in the office, you have the potential impact of hitting staff morale. So we're touching on your documentation now. So with the whole COVID situation, a lot of employers and companies may not have been aware and may have missed that on the 6th of April, the Good Work Plan came into effect. These do carry specific requirements from the employer. So it is the right, day one right for workers and employees to receive the contract of employment, where previously it was up to 2 months. There are specific terms that need to be within the contracts of employment. There are training entitlements, and then obviously employee benefits need to be laid out. So within the specific terms, there are mandatory policies that need to be outlined. So things like your sickness leave, your family and parental leave, bereavement leave, all of these need to be outlined very clearly for the employee. The days of work, probationary periods, those are elements that need to be included, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail when we send out the slides on the PDF so that you can see each breakdown and have a very simple view of what needs to be included.
Jason, could I just ask, this is just a question for myself, what will be the consequences if they don't have this in place from day one? I'm just worried, obviously, at the moment with COVID and the lockdown, there's a lot going on, as you say. Is there any leeway there for employers on the webinar?
The only risk of not having your contracts and handbooks in line with the legal requirements is it falls under the Employment Rights Act, either Section 1 or Section 4. The risk of that comes down to if an employee takes a claim forward to an employment tribunal, and subsequently if the employee then makes a claim under those sections, they can be awarded either 2 or 4 weeks based on that claim, based on how kind of out of sync your contracts are. Don't ask me why the tribunals have made it 2 or 4 weeks.
Right.
I don't know.
But there is a financial consequence if
potentially, yes. Yeah. We don't scaremonger because potentially employees may not, but it is a risk.
Yeah.
Okay. So we touched on the loan and remote working now. So these are elements that employers need to take into consideration. I'll not kind of run through each one on an individual basis because they're on screen. Something I will touch on quite a bit is the risk assessments and the employee equipment. A lot of organizations have been thrown into this situation, obviously with the lockdown being announced very quickly and companies having to adapt very quickly. If you haven't carried out a risk assessment or had your employees carry out a risk assessment or carried out a DSE, start looking at that moving forward. Now, whilst there has been some leeway, if this is a long-term thing that companies are having to enforce, the HSE will start looking at it. And it comes down to your obligations as an employer as well. So ensuring the right equipment's in place, you've carried out those risk assessments, or the employee on behalf has carried out those risk assessments, and documenting everything to make sure that if anything is audited down the line, you have that in place. We'll touch on reasonable adjustments because that obviously again is part of an employer obligations. Again, that can be the potential equipment that's supplied to individuals in their home, it can be the working patterns, whether the individual, because of childcare, because of any disabilities, needs those adjustments in place. As an employer, you need to be looking at that and taking those considerations into place. And it's good to be proactive and ask the employees whether they need any support or whether they need any adjustments to their work life. But that's for each individual organisation to decide whether they want to, how proactive they want to be. Communication and work-life balance is an area that's high in focus. I think the CIPD carried out an analysis, and 57% of remote workers check their emails outside of working hours. Now, with the high focus on mental health and burnout now being recognised by the World Health Organization, it's an area that employers should be looking at to ensure that employees aren't spending too much time constantly on their phones or constantly checking emails or feel that they have to. Now, we'll use our example, and Sharon's here and she'll hopefully advocate. I like to send messages out just to get the thing off my mind, whatever it is. But if I get a reply at 7, 8 o'clock at night on a Friday, I straight away ask them what they're doing on their phones. The phone should be off. You know, I love the enthusiasm from Sharon and Lisa, but their own time, the personal time, is their personal time. I don't want them kind of constantly glued to their work phone in case a message comes through. And that's something that is in high focus with the mental health being part of it.
Jason, could you just pause at that point? There's just a number of queries just come through just in relation to those. I'll go through them one by one if I may. I think there'll be relatively short answers. First question is can you give a definition of what you feel is classed as long-term remote working, or is that dependent upon the individual situation?
It'll be dependent on the individual situation. I mean, if we look at how long we're potentially going to be remote working, if 3 to 6 months, I would still put those measures in place, any risk assessments now, just so you're being proactive with it.
Okay. The next 4 are very similar, so I'll try and group them together. I think a few people have raised the questions about the risk assessments for home working and whether or not you're able to give them access to any templates for this. It feels a bit of a recurring theme here. John Myhill has asked, are home working surveys necessary, workspace, furniture, equipment, etc. as part of the risk assessment process? So it does feel that maybe there's some concerns about whether we're fully undertaking as appropriate the home working risk assessment. So
obviously, as I mentioned, you know, we are seeing a different approach to situations. I don't want to generalize, but based on the queries we're currently getting, SMEs seem to be more flexible and adaptable to the changes and to the look at flexibility, so the remote working. Larger organizations, in my experience to date, are more inclined to get back to what we refer to now as the old norm. And when you're looking at those aspects, not just from the risk analysis, but you're looking at the employee engagement and staff morale, you need to look at all elements. So first of all, ask yourself the question, is it essential that staff need to return to the office? Are you communicating well with the employees as to when they're returning and the setup of the return? You know, the COVID situation has created a lot of anxiety for people. Myself, you know, we've got people working out the back and even just going out communicating them, keeping 2 meters away, 3 meters away. You're fully conscious. You're conscious of how close you've got to that person. You're conscious of what you're touching. It is creating a lot of anxiety out there. So communication is key to the employees about what measures you're putting in place as an employer to reassure them that they don't think, oh, I've got to return to the office I'm going to catch something, or are we prepped? And that goes into the next couple of scenarios. So enacting your social distancing policies in line with the government guidelines and your risk assessments. And this will identify things like the hot desks. And so it's currently advised that hot desks isn't utilised because you don't want multiple people currently in and out using the same surfaces, using the same laptops, or whatever equipment it is that they may be utilising. Cleaning, again, having a robust cleaning schedule, cleaning program in place, whether it's done internally, whether you outsource it to a commercial cleaning company, whatever it is, that you have that in place on a regular basis. And the same with access to sanitation products, PPE, and any training needs to be enacted. It seems silly to say, why do I need to train people on how to keep 2 meters apart? But it comes down to your due diligence as an employer to ensure that if you're audited by the HSE, for example, that you can turn around and say, this is what we've done, and give them list after list of documents and training modules that you've given to employees and what you've done as part of bringing them back to the office. Not saying the HSE will be carrying out audits on every organisation, but they will be doing spot checks on some to make sure that the measures in place are effective. So we touched on some of these elements as we went through. So if we, risks of returning too early as an organisation, so the HSE investigations, staff morale, increased mental health concerns, refusal by the employee to return to the office because they don't feel the measures you have put in place are sufficient enough, and the measures for refusal to return and the consequences. And this kind of touched on the conduct and capability procedures, predominantly the conduct. If an employee refuses to return to the office, you have to look at the reasons for refusal. Are they just refusing because they don't want to have to travel? They don't want to have to travel 40 minutes, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it is. They've enjoyed working at home. Or are they raising legitimate concerns that need to be addressed? So we look at our elements like raising a health and safety concern. Disciplining an employee for raising a health and safety concern could put the organisation at risk. Falls under the automatically unfair if you were to dismiss the employee for that reason. So always look and investigate why an employee is refusing to return before you take out any formal action. And that comes down to good quality communication with the employee.
Jason, just at that point, one of the attendees has made a very good point. Obviously, we're going through the employer's responsibilities. Given that a lot of employees are desperate to go back, is there a message that should also be sent out to almost to encourage them if they're not feeling, not just with the mental health concerns, but physically on top form, that obviously we don't want a second wave, so we don't want to encourage people to go back if we're not expecting them to go back, so to speak, if they're not feeling on top physical health-wise.
Yeah. And this comes down to the flexibility of the employer. I've seen some organisations have turned around despite any government guidelines and saying we are not open in the office until 2021 at the earliest. So employers are taking that proactive approach to say, listen, this is working for the time being. I'm going to stick with it for the rest of the year to make sure that any second wave, if it occurs, doesn't impact us again and you're not put at risk. And then we'll look at the situation again in January 2021. Now that's a way few and far between, but as an organisation, that's an element you can look to take. But again, it's about communicating with staff because not all staff enjoy working from home at the same time. Some staff do like coming back into the office. They do enjoy that social interaction. So it's about that communication within your team.
Could I, again, sorry, just a question on this about returning early, especially at the moment when firms are going in small numbers. And again, it's probably a straightforward answer that you can give to this. For those who've got childcare with the child not in school, I'm sure the employee is not expected to go back, but are the circumstances, legality around that, where an employer says you have to come in or we want you to come in and there's no childcare? Which obviously could occur at the moment with only a few young people back.
The last time I checked, it was a few days ago, last time I checked, individuals that are still off for caring responsibilities, which includes childcare, can still be placed on furlough.
Right.
If an employer doesn't want to keep them on furlough, then the individual, if they don't have childcare, has the right to request parental leave. Or if they have no childcare, no support network, then it comes down to time off at dependence. So there are different avenues, but I would encourage employers to speak to the employees in regards to the childcare arrangements. But my advice to clients would be flexible in that approach, because you've got a parent there that's looking after a child for whatever reasons, whether it's by themselves or whether they're with a partner and supporting each other. So that's my advice to my clients. Now, whatever approach other organizations want to take, or whatever approach they want to take on the back of my advice, that's their prerogative.
Okay. Again, another attendee, if I may just ask another question, and it's obviously in the news at the moment, is the track and trace process that the government are currently operating. Obviously, if one person comes back, tests positive, there's a big implication. And if there's a number of people in the office, how can we reduce that risk? Or I suppose, how can a company give guidance to try to avoid to reduce that risk?
Yeah, I think I haven't looked at the specific guidelines in regards to the track and trace, but my rudimentary understanding is that they ask specific questions, predominantly if you've been in contact with someone for 15 minutes or more, less than 2 meters. So I'll have a look into that and I'll ping that out as part of the PDF in a bit more definition. But I don't think it's literally you've walked past someone and they need to be named. I think there are certain criteria for that individual then to be flagged up on the track and trace, to then be part of the group of people that are then told to isolate because they've been in contact with this person. But don't quote me on that just yet. I'll verify that afterwards.
Thank you, Jason, and good question, John. Thank you.
So touching on obviously a topic that is going to be big over the coming months, and we're already starting to see large organisations talk about this and plan for this, is the redundancies and the restructures. I am going to end up going back to the presentator view just for the the main information. So, so there are set processes in regards to what needs to be followed when looking at redundancies or restructures. So you'll have heard by now certain consultations need to be carried out, and there are certain time frames at which they need to be carried out. So if you're looking to make between 20 and 99 redundancies within a 90-day window for a proposal for that, you need to consult for at least 30 days before any dismissals take place. 100 or more redundancies, you need to start at least 45 days before any dismissals take place. Now, as well as that, if you are proposing 20 or more, you need to notify, it's the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, sort of EIS, and that's carried out through a HR1 form. So if you are potentially making that many people redundant, you need to follow that set process. So yeah, they're the consultation periods. If it's less than 20, then there's no minimum time period that you need to consult, but there is still a fair process that needs to be followed. So generally speaking, and it is a general overview, there tends to be about 3 meetings before a decision is made. Now, that's not subscriptive, that's not for every organisation, it's just generally what's considered best practice. You initially have a consultation meeting with the staff, outline what is going to be happening. You then look as a management at your selection criteria and your scoring matrix. Now, some organizations do weight certain criteria more heavily than others. So things like your technical abilities, your skills, qualifications, they can be weighted heavily. During the selection matrix, what I would recommend is be very careful of any discriminatory targets or any discriminatory weighting. So for example, if you have sickness as part of one of your scoring matrix, if someone has been off a lot, for example, for pregnancy-related sicknesses, you would need to discount them, because if you're counting them as part of the scoring matrix and they're scoring lower, then you've got potentially a discriminatory scoring element. So you need to be looking at what you're doing and does it actually put people of certain groups at a disadvantage. Then you obviously need to give staff notice. You can work out the redundancy pay, and the government have an online redundancy calculator that's very simple and very easy to use. If you're offering alternative roles, you can do it on a trial period. There's a 4-week trial period that an employee can decide, trial a role, an alternative role, to see if it's right for them, and the organisation can see if it's right for them. But the key thing that we try to get through to clients throughout this process is the support of staff, whether it's that's supporting them going to interviews, whether it's supporting them with regards to finding other jobs, whatever it may be. That's how you're going to be remembered as an organization when that person leaves. So it's how you make someone feel will be the key defining factor. You have a process to follow. We understand that. I'm sure the employees will understand that. But it's how you carry that out as an employer that will be telling.
Thanks, Jason. I've just got a quick question about, well, it's pertinent, just about, again, going back to slightly, a couple of minutes ago, returning to the office. Again, a very relevant question by an attendee. If an employee has an underlying health condition and is in the wider vulnerable group, which obviously many people are employers able to make these people return, i.e., discarding the situation? So they're encouraged to stay off of the government, but can the employer insist that they return?
Again, we go back to the point, is it necessary that they return? So is it that they still have to shield? I know the government are starting to send out the messages now that individuals don't need to shield after a certain date, but you need to look at it from an individual point of view, because let's go on a worst case scenario that they end up contracting COVID from your workplace. The risks and the legal implications for you as an employer post, whatever the situation is that comes from that, can be huge, from a liability point of view. So ask yourself, is it necessary, or can some flexibility be found within that arrangement?
Thanks, Jess. Just another question now, just on the last slide. It's a technical question. When working out redundancy pay, does the individual accrue holidays whilst on furlough?
So yeah, individuals are still accruing holiday whilst they're on furlough.
Thank you.
And if you get them to work through the notice period, they'll still accrue that. So holiday will accrue up until the point of termination.
Thank you.
Another area that is being focused on is changing contracts. So we're touching on this again. The technical terminology is some other substantial reason. So what you in effect doing when you amend contractual terms and conditions is you are terminating one contract of employment and issuing out a new one. And it's about the process that is followed as to whether that is fair. So the main areas that you need to focus on is, do you have a strong business case as to why you need to be going through these changes? So they generally fall under an economic, technical, or organizational change. So whether it's restructures, whether it's, if you don't make these changes, the company's going to go under, things like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are going under, but it's a strong indication from an economic factor. In line with kind of the redundancy and the restructures, amended change terms and conditions, there's a process to follow. And you go through a consultation with staff to try and get their agreement in the first instance. If you can get an agreement and get everyone to agree and sign it, that they accept the new terms and conditions, that's great. Something I'll highlight, and something that's overlooked sometimes even by employment lawyers, is even if a member of staff agrees to change their contract of employment, if they've got more than 2 years service, they can take a claim forward. They can stand and sue to an employment tribunal to challenge the reasonableness of that termination. It sounds weird that they've agreed to the change but can still stand and sue, but it's something that's overlooked significantly. It's not always, very rarely, initiated by an employee because they've agreed to the changes, so why would they stand and sue? But it is something to be wary of. And then, as I said, as you're going through the process, the key factor in any of these processes is reasonableness. Why is the business having to go through this process? What are your business cases for enacting these changes? And also, if you are making these changes, if you have to enforce it, always allow the right to appeal if the employees do want to appeal. The leading precedent case law did outline that the reasonableness of, it was a local authority, and they had carried out an assessment of an employee and found that she was actually working a different job to what she was. So they went through an amendment to change terms and conditions to put her on the salary banding of the job that she should have been carried out. They didn't do any proper meetings. They didn't allow the right to appeal. And she naturally took the case forward to an employment tribunal. The actual business case was found to be fair. The reason that the tribunal awarded unfair dismissal to the employees because the process that was followed. So because they hadn't held any proper formal meetings, because they hadn't allowed the right to appeal, they issued out an award They reduced the award based on the employee's refusal to accept the lesser salary in the new role, or the role that she was carrying out. But it highlighted the significance of a process within when you're looking at changing terms and conditions. One area everyone wanted to focus on quite significantly is team engagement. Now, the difficulty with team engagement is there's no one size fits all for any organization. Each team member will have their own drives, their own motivation, things that keep them ticking over. And for one person, that could be a financial aspect. For another, it could be working for an organization that lets them work from home 5 days a week. You know, it's each individual employee has their own motivation. The key factors for an employer is give the team a sense of belonging. So get them to buy into your organization, have a clear ethos and clear values that you want to portray to the wider public and to the team. Define your goals. So what do you want to achieve as an organization, and what do you want the individual members to achieve? If you just send someone working from home at the moment and they're just doing their day-to-day activity, but they have no idea what their goals are, their targets are, it's very easy for them to just get lost, just constantly doing the same thing over and over again and not feeling motivated and not feeling engaged as a team member. It was only this morning, I was reading an article by Michael Lough of Blue Wren that outlined that companies that have team engagement and have strategies in place, they're 5 times more likely to be high-performing organizations than those that don't, which is quite a significant statistic when you look at it. And also on the same study, employees that are engaged actually carry out tasks 64% more effectively and longer than those that are disengaged, which you can understand from an individual basis. If you're sat there just doing, I'll not say a boring task, but if you're just doing a task for hours on end, you very quickly switch off, especially if there are distractions at home. Some of the elements that you can put in place is improved communication strategy and regular communication, and checking in with staff. Now, there are different systems and different ways to carry out those. You know, picking up the telephone, sending a WhatsApp message. Some companies have an intranet. Some companies just ping out mass emails. Each organization will need to define what is best for them. Do you need to be sending out an email to every single member of staff with a news update? Or is there other more effective ways? When I've worked at larger organizations and they've had the intranet, it has been quite useful because as an employee, I wasn't getting bombarded with email after email saying this new news update. So I was able to focus on my job, but when I wanted to see what was happening within the organization, I could look on the internet, spend a bit of time and feel engaged through that method. So on the efficient collaboration, again, that touches on the sense of belonging and the team engagement. And that's building a team environment and collaborating with each other and team members, whether it's on an individual basis or a team basis, and getting them to buy into what they are doing and what the company is doing. Encourage knowledge sharing. Everyone on this Zoom and everyone within any organization will have their own experience and will have their own knowledge. And it's always great to utilize that, great to share that. You know, I take the example of HR and employment law. It is vast. You know, when I was internal HR and I moved to outsourcing, I quickly realized that I knew very little in the overall scheme of employment law because of the differentiation to a certain extent. And having knowledge sharing with colleagues, with friends, even till this morning, we share experience, we ask each other questions, and our WhatsApp group between us, we have a combined experience of over 120 years. So it just shows you that there's still a lot of information out there and knowledge that needs to be shared. So I would always encourage clients to utilize that, whether that's knowledge sharing through the internet, through emails, or even just training, having someone be a mentor to a new member of staff or to another member of staff to build up their knowledge base and their skill set. And then last but not least, the social activities. Now, that's kind of a bit more difficult given the current circumstances. The Friday drinks or the Friday pizzas are a bit on hold for the time being, but I've seen organizations adapt to this again. You have Zoom quizzes, you've got karaoke's, you've got house parties through Zoom. So there are ways to still carry out social activities and get the team engaged and having that interaction outside of the working time. You know, something we do at NORI is Friday, 3 o'clock, we have a Zoom meeting. Well, when we go back to face-to-face, it'll be face-to-face. But we have a Zoom meeting and we just catch up. We do a little bit of an agenda and then we just catch up. Now, I won't say how long we sit there drinking for, but Sharon will probably start laughing. But it's nice to kind of have that interaction and get a lot off our chest. The first couple of weeks, I know it was very tough for all of us. And we did use each other as a bit of a support network to unload. And it was nice that we had that support and that social interaction, even if it was through Zoom. If
I may as well, somebody has sent a question just regarding the redundancy, just a bit of protocol question. Yeah. Obviously, because we're working as we are at the moment, the question is, at individual consultation meetings, does the employee still have the right to have a colleague or trade union representative in attendance?
In the formal meetings, yes, they've still got the right to be accompanied in any meeting that could lead to a termination. So yeah, again, inviting individuals, letting them be accompanied via Zoom is absolutely fine. Obviously follow that process. If you are using Zoom and you're recording the meeting, obviously you still need to get consent of all parties in order to record. So that's following GDPR.
Thank you.
Okay. In regards to capability and conduct procedures, I don't want to touch too heavily on this because not a lot has ultimately changed, and you kind of just asked that, answered the last one, or the second last one, Ian, with regards to the right to be accompanied. So they still remain the same in regards to a fair process being followed. So if you are going to formal meetings, do you need them to be face-to-face? You know, I've already heard of clients doing a lot of virtual meetings, whether it's redundancy consultation, whether it's disciplinary hearings. They are switching to virtual meetings because it's not a requirement for the individual to be there to go through the points at hand. So again, that comes down to, as an employer, your flexibility within these circumstances and looking at the reasonableness of what you're asking. You know, if you're asking an employee to come into the workplace, but you've put no measures in place to ensure that workplace is safe, then you're putting yourself as an employer at risk. So always look at the situation and what you need to do. Hearings and appeals, again, look at your contracts, look at your handbooks, look at the procedures you've laid down. If you don't have contracts and handbooks, first of all, I'd encourage you to get them sorted very quickly, but follow the ACAS code of practice in that instance if you haven't got them in place for the time being.
Jason, could I just ask a question for myself? Obviously, if they're not able to go into the office for a face-to-face meeting, are they able to turn down the option of a virtual meeting because they're not comfortable with that? Or would that, is it a reasonable request, i.e. to request a virtual meeting, or can the individual say, no, it's not for me, I'm not comfortable with that?
I would always get the employer to ask why they're not comfortable. And see if any kind of middle ground can be. If the employee is adamant they're not attending, then what I'd always encourage the employer to do is get them to put the allegations to the employee and get written submissions. So in other words, the employee's defense to the allegations that are put to them. So this is what you're accused of, or this is, you know, your performance levels. Can you give me a detailed explanation? But I always encourage in the first instance to have those meetings because it's more fluid and you can ask more questions.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Apologies. Can I go back? This again, just a couple of questions have come in, and then obviously we might open it up if we've got a little bit of time. First one is just going back to the risk assessments. Obviously, everybody had to go to home working almost overnight for March the 23rd. If that employee who's working from home doesn't have the equipment, the table, the desk, the chairs to work on, does the employer have the legal requirement? Do they have to purchase it for them, or is the responsibility of the employee? Where does the rules around that lie?
Well, if you're carrying out, I'll get a detailed answer, but what I would initially say is if you're as an employer saying to an employee that they have to work from home and they don't have the right equipment, for example, I've seen on LinkedIn someone working off an ironing board. You know, if they completed DSE for that, are they actually in line with, will they pass that DSE? Will it meet the requirements? The answer is no. I mean, employees turn around to the employer and say, right, well, actually, I'm failing the DSE because I don't have this equipment. And the employer needs to look at its obligations under the health and safety executive and look at whether they need to supply that. So in a roundabout way, the employer would then need to look at supplying that equipment for the employee as a reasonable adjustment.
Reasonable request. The next one, and the individual concerned has said it is slightly off topic a bit, so I think there's a bit of common sense probably for the answer. Obviously, as we're all working remote, or quite a lot of people are still working from remote, what, in terms of informing the employee that there is a case against them before any hearing, how is that broached in a time that we're working virtually? So I can imagine it could come as a bit of a shock, or what's the process for informing that individual that there's potential employment case against them?
Well, it's basically like, imagine you were in the office, but you're not now in the office. You always carry out an investigation. So the first basis of the investigation can be either picking up the telephone and speaking to the employee in the first instance, or going on a Zoom and asking them the questions. So I would always encourage every employer, if they've got a situation with an employee, to do your investigations to make sure that there is grounds to move forward to a formal hearing. So whichever method as an employer you're more comfortable with. But as I say, I always, at the moment, I'm encouraging clients Zoom. If the employee or the employer doesn't want to do Zoom, at least a telephone call, because they're more fluid and you can get more out of them than you would if you were just literally to email the employee saying, this is what I'm accusing you of, or this is what you've been accused of. What's your response?
Okay, thank you. Next question is just about leave. And an attendee just wants to know about the process with regards to asking the employee to take accrued leave prior to the return. I'm assuming rather than holding it all together and taking it all at once when they go back.
Yeah, so employers can enforce annual leave on an employee. There are requirements. So an employer needs to give twice as much notice of what they're requesting the employee to take, not including weekends. Simple way to look at that is, as an employer, if you're asking someone to take a week's annual leave, you need to give them 2 weeks notice, not including the weekends.
Right, okay. The next one was just about the redundancy. And it's just, if a position is being made redundant, e.g. it's been outsourced moving forward, and there is only one person in that position, do you still have to score them even though there was only one person in that role?
You wouldn't look to score that individual because there is only one person, but what would you look at? You'd look at your organizational chart. If they've got more than 2 years service, this comes down to the reasonableness of your process. So for example, if you've got an employee in one position, but as an organization, you've got 5 other positions in different departments. And that employee, let's for example say, has previously worked in one of the other departments, so could do the other role. When you're following your redundancy process, one of the key aspects for an employee, you need to look at suitable alternatives. So is there a suitable alternative that this employee could carry out? Now, if they've worked in a different department previously, well, that would be considered a suitable alternative. So then what would you look at is scoring the individual in the other department and that individual that's where the role is being made redundant. And that falls in line with a fair process. It's not always necessary, but you would need to look at individual elements like that so that you couldn't be challenged. Because if you were challenged down the line on the reasonableness and they highlighted that as the tribunal may look at that and ask the question of the employer, why did you not score them for that? If you've got no reasonable explanation, then you could be putting yourself at risk. If there is a reasonable explanation as to why you, as an employer, you didn't consider that alternative role a suitable alternative, then great. You need to justify that.